Ayes have it. Motion on Charter for Budget Responsibility. Minister to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It feels like I was only in the House a few moments ago, but I'm delighted to be back at the dispatch box for this important debate. And I beg to move, therefore, that the motion in the name of the Chancellor be moved. Madam Deputy Speaker, sustained economic growth supported by sound investment is the only route to improving the prosperity of our country, and in doing so the living standards of working people, which is why growth is the primary mission of this government. Madam Deputy Speaker, this debate is timely, as the House knows, given that the Chancellor gave her growth speech only this morning. In her speech, she reiterated that without a stable economy, we cannot hope to attract investment into the UK, that we cannot grow our economy with a black hole in our public finances, and importantly, that fixing the foundations of the economy starts with the new fiscal rules, which we are voting on here today. In her speech, the Chancellor announced that we are taking difficult decisions in the long-term interests of the country, including, for example, on a third runway at Heathrow. As the Chancellor set out, the government supports and is inviting proposals for a third runway at Heathrow Airport to be brought forward by the summer. Once proposals have been received, we will take forward a full assessment through the Airport National Policy Statement to ensure that any scheme is delivered in line with our legal, environmental and climate obligations. According to a recent study from Frontier Economics, a third runway could increase potential GDP by 0.43% over the next 25 years. Over half, around 60%, of that boost is estimated to go to areas outside of London and the South East, underlying the fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Heathrow as a hub airport brings prosperity not just to London, but to every region and nation of the country. The government has also set out further plans to reform our planning system, to provide confidence to investors and to builders, to show that Britain can get building again and that we can deliver on our promises. Madam Deputy Speaker, confidence starts with stability. Stability is the precondition to a healthy, growing economy because it gives UK businesses and households the essential confidence they need to spend and invest, encouraging innovation and boosting our economy. In outlining our new, robust and transparent fiscal framework, the Charter for Budget Responsibility that we are voting on today provides a vital, stable foundation from which our economy can grow. And it is clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the instability of the last 14 years has given us: low productivity, rising debt levels, and declining public service performance. Public sector net debt is 97.2% of GDP, and net financial debt remains close to its highest recorded level as a share of GDP reached in the pandemic. Per capita GDP remains 0.8% below pre-pandemic levels. In contrast, Madam Deputy Speaker, had the UK economy grown at the average rate, just the average rate, of OECD economies over the last 14 years, our economy would have been over £150 billion larger than it is today. Public investment in the UK has historically been low and inconsistent. Our public capital stock as a share of GDP is the joint lowest in the G7 and more than 10 percentage points below the G7 median. And underneath all of these challenges was a £22 billion black hole of in-year spending pressures which were not disclosed by the previous government either to Parliament, the public or the Office for Budget Responsibility. My honourable colleague, the Shadow Chief Secretary, seems to have comments on the £22 billion black hole. I'll happily take an intervention from him. I can't take an intervention, I'm told, Madam Deputy Speaker. That's very sad. But in that context, I look forward to the Shadow Chief Secretary in his statement, outlining how that £22 billion black hole came into being.
The Minister, if you wish to, can take an intervention. But this reminds me when all three of us spent many years together as Business and Trade Committee when we couldn't agree on anything either. I return to the Minister.
I was always enamoured by your arguments, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I continue to be today. And I look forward to the prospect of many interventions from members across the House as part of this important debate and encourage the honourable member to do so.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to intervene on the Chief Secretary Treasury. Could he just confirm, did the OBR validate his claim of £22 billion?
The OBR was very clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, as members of the House will see in their publications in the Library of the House, that the spending plans announced by the previous government were a fiction, to quote the chair of the OBR in his evidence to the Treasury Select Committee. And in the OBR forecast provided to this government, made it very clear that had the in-year spending pressure been transparently reported, their last forecast under the last administration would have been, quote, materially different. That shows that the lack of transparency on in-year spending was a secret held by only a few ministers under the last government, and neither the public, Parliament, or as we were in opposition, or the OBR knew about that problem. And that's why this government has already legislated to bring forward additional strengthened powers for independent checks and balances and transparency. And we have committed, as a government, to share in-year spending pressures with the Office of Budget Responsibility so that we can never end up in a situation like the one we inherited before. The Chancellor's autumn budget put the public finances back on track, and we will keep them there. Our commitment to sound public finances is non-negotiable. Our new Charter for Budget Responsibility, underpinned by the new fiscal rules, ensures a more transparent fiscal framework and provides a stable foundation for growth. Today, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will outline the changes we have made to the Charter for Budget Responsibility as published in draft at the Autumn Budget 2024 and laid before this House last week. Fiscal rules are a key part of the UK fiscal framework. At Autumn Budget 2024, the Chancellor confirmed the government's fiscal rules, as set out in our manifesto, which will play a vital role in unlocking investment. These rules will put the public finances on a sustainable path and prioritise investment to support long-term growth. They consist of two rules: the Stability Rule and the Investment Rule. The Stability Rule aims to move the current budget into balance so that day-to-day spending is met by revenues, meaning that the government will only borrow for investment. We will meet this rule in 2029-2030 until that becomes the third year of the forecast. From that point on, we will balance the current budget in the third year of every budget, held annually each autumn. This will provide a tougher constraint on day-to-day spending, so that difficult decisions cannot be constantly delayed or deferred as they were under the last government. And I'm sure the House would recommend, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the government should live within its means. That means that public services have to be able to live within their budgets, and it means that tax revenues have to pay for day-to-day spendings. Never again, Madam Deputy Speaker, will we end up in the position the country ended up in under the last government, where every week and every month the country borrowed more and more in order to pay for the day-to-day bills. And that's why when honourable members on the benches opposite complain about the debt burden this country is having to deal with, they should look in the mirror, Madam Deputy Speaker, because they built up that debt burden. The people responsible for filling up the country's credit card just to pay the bills every month, even in advance of the pandemic, Madam Deputy Speaker, were Conservative ministers. That will never happen under a Labour government because of our clear fiscal rules. And it's why, for the first time in 17 years, we're doing a zero-based review of all public spending, not once done under the last administration, but done in the first spending review of this Labour government. Second, our investment rule requires the government to reduce net financial debt, defined as public sector net financial liabilities, or PSNUFL, as a share of the economy. Public sector net financial liabilities is an accredited official statistic produced by the Office for National Statistics since 2016, based on international statistical guidance, and has been forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility since that time. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has noted that the metric offers, and I quote, a more complete picture of the government's financial position, while removing some of the perverse incentives associated with a narrow focus on public sector net debt. This rule keeps debt on a sustainable path while allowing the step change needed in investment by targeting a measure of debt that captures not just the debt that government owes, but also financial assets that are expected to generate future returns. By targeting net financial debt for the investment rule, the government is prioritising investment to drive long-term growth, while getting debt falling as a share of the economy. The move to net financial debt will be supported by a comprehensive set of guardrails to give confidence that there are rules around the investments the country can make. Like our stability rule, our investment rule will apply in 2029-2030 until that year becomes the third year of the forecast. And from that point onwards, net financial debt will fall in the third year of every forecast. The move to net financial debt means that at the autumn budget, the government was in a position to confirm public investment that will be £100 billion higher over the forecast period compared to the previous government's plans. I'm pleased to say that in their autumn forecast, the Office of Budget Responsibility confirmed that the government is on track to meet both fiscal rules 2 years early, in 2027-28, displaying the government's commitment to sound finances. The Chancellor has asked the Office of Budget Responsibility to produce a forecast on the 26th of March, which will assess us against these rules once again. And our commitment to these fiscal rules is ironclad. The UK has changed its fiscal rules in the past more than any other country. But this government knows that stability matters. That is why the new charter sets out clearer circumstances under which the fiscal rules can temporarily be suspended through a new strengthened escape clause. The new escape clause requires a decision on suspension be supported by the Office of Budget Responsibility's analysis, so the rules can only be suspended with sufficient justification. As well as new fiscal rules, Madam Deputy Speaker, the updated Charter for Budget Responsibility includes a set of wider reforms that ensure a more stable and transparent fiscal framework. Because fiscal responsibility is so central to this government's mission, the first piece of legislation passed in this Parliament was the Budget Responsibility Act. It delivered our manifesto commitment to introduce a fiscal lock. I don't think members on either side of the House need reminding of what happens when huge unfunded fiscal commitments are made without proper scrutiny, and key economic institutions such as the Office of Budget Responsibility are sidelined. We will not let that happen again. The fiscal lock, therefore, guarantees in law that from now on, every fiscally significant change to tax and spending will be subject to scrutiny by the independent Office of Budget Responsibility. The Charter sets out the detail for how the fiscal lock will operate, as well as new guiding fiscal principles to move towards only borrowing for investment and to keep debt on a sustainable path. The Office of Budget Responsibility will monitor progress against a dashboard of key debt sustainability metrics to ensure the government is taking a broad view of fiscal sustainability. A broader view will allow the government to form a full assessment of the sustainability of the public finances and support us in seeking to improve sustainability over time. We are also enhancing fiscal and economic stability by confirming in the Charter today that the government's intention to move to one major fiscal event per year will be honoured, giving families and businesses certainty of tax and spending plans. By requiring the Treasury to conduct regular spending reviews every 2 years and setting spending for at least 3 years, ensuring public services have certainty on their funding and that spending decisions cannot be repeatedly delayed again. And in addition, it guarantees a 3-year rolling budget for the Office for Budget Responsibility to support its independence. We are further strengthening fiscal transparency and accountability by accepting all of the recommendations of the Office of Budget Responsibility's review of the March 2024 forecast for departmental expenditure limits, including to improve the spending information that the Treasury shares with the Office of Budget Responsibility. The Office of Budget Responsibility is widely recognised as providing independent, credible and high-quality analysis. It is a guarantor of economic stability. Going forward, the Treasury will provide the OBR with information on the in-year position, allowing it to forecast underspending and overspending against departmental expenditure limits where appropriate. This will ensure the unfunded pressures identified at the public spending audit never happen again. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are a government who will consider the impact of our current spending decisions on future generations, and to show how the long-term health of the public balance sheet is bolstered by sound investment, the Charter requires the Office of Budget Responsibility to report on the long-term impact of capital investment and other policies at fiscal events. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I turn to the welfare cap, which we are also debating today. The Government is retaining a welfare cap within its fiscal framework to support its ambitions to keep welfare spending sustainable in the medium term. The Office of Budget Responsibility will assess whether the new cap has been met at the first fiscal event of the next Parliament. The latest Office of Budget Responsibility forecast judged the previous welfare cap to be breached by £8.6 billion, following a trend of forecasted breaches by the previous government. This is clearly an unsustainable path for welfare spending. This breach underlines the inheritance left by the previous government, a failure to control welfare spending and to bring forward radical reform, and crucially, a failure from the last government to support people to get the treatment or skills they need in order to return to work. I shall.
Point. In the assessment he's making, what estimation has he made of the increase in poverty, the increase in child poverty in our society, and the effects of largely uncontrolled rents in the private rented sector, which dent into and often well above the local housing allowance, which leads people into poverty? I'd be grateful if he could outline those issues.
Knows that the Labour Party takes child poverty seriously. That's why we launched the Child Poverty Task Force at the start of this government, co-chaired by the Work and Pension Secretary and the Education Secretary, to do a root and branch review of the long-term structural causes of child poverty and the interventions that government could take in order to reverse these growing trends that none of us across the House want to see. The task force will report in the coming months, but he is right to point out to the House that housing costs and insecure housing have, in recent years, become an ever important driver of child poverty. That's why in the bill already introduced to this House by the Deputy Prime Minister, we're taking action in the private rented sector to provide additional protections and support for families in rental accommodation, for example, banning no-fault evictions and giving more security about tenure for people who are renting. The Honourable Member, as much as I am sure, will have lots of casework in the past where hard-working families who are just trying to make ends meet and to provide security of income and a roof over the head for them and their families are often failed by a market where house prices both to buy and to rent are out of reach, and the rate at which we build affordable and social housing is not meeting the demand for the people who need it. That's why we increased funding at the budget by £500 million to build more affordable and social housing, which we know can be delivered quickly. On a visit last week to Erewash, I was visiting social housing developments supported by Homes England and learnt from the company building these homes for East Midlands Housing Association that it only takes 14 to 16 weeks to start laying the foundations through to giving the key to the person moving in. And it reminds us why our reform agenda is so important, because the time around building, on planning, on consenting, on infrastructure, on financing deals, has been holding back significantly the rate of development of social and affordable housing across the country. But those are exactly the issues where government has the ability to make a difference. And that's why we're committed to accelerating on our housing plans to build 1.5 million homes a year, but crucially to tilt that towards more affordable and social housing to support people across the country. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government is resetting the welfare cap, given that the previous welfare cap was repeatedly breached. And we're doing so based on the latest Office of Budget Responsibility forecast to set a new target for 2029-30, alongside our action to control welfare spending, but to also help people who deserve the assistance. This government has demonstrated it will not shy away from doing what is needed to put welfare spending on a more sustainable path, for example, with difficult decisions such as targeting winter fuel payments to those who need them the most and reclaiming £4.3 billion of public money lost to fraud and error in the welfare system in 2029-30 and £9.2 billion over 5 years. We've also announced steps to tackle inactivity through the Get Britain Working White Paper, and we'll set out further proposals through the Health and Disability Green Paper later in spring. Progress against the cap will be monitored by the Treasury and the Department for Work and Pensions. This will include a strengthened accountability framework and DWP publishing an annual report on welfare spending. By strengthening the accountability of the welfare cap, getting more people into work, and reforming the welfare system for long-term sustainability, we are taking the necessary steps to keep spending under control. But crucially, we are also serving the people of this country by making sure that for people who, for too long, have been at home unable to be seen in the NHS or to get access to mental health services, unable to get the training or support they need to take advantage of the jobs available in our country, unable to find jobs near where they are, that they see hope in their futures, that they know they have a government on their side that will support them to get back into work, the outcome that is better for them and better for their family finances and their futures, but also supports us in ensuring fiscal stability. Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, the reforms to the fiscal framework outlined in the new Charter for Budget Responsibility will ensure a more stable approach to tax and spend, as well as better transparency and accountability for our and future governments. And that stability is inseparable from our plans for growth. And alongside that growth, restoring stability means the government can pay for increased funding to repair, reform and modernise our public services and to invest in the infrastructure needed to rebuild Britain. And for these reasons, Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend the motion to the House.
The question is, as on the order paper, before I call the Shadow Minister to clear up any confusion, this is the Charter for Budget Responsibility debate and motion. The next motion and debate is the welfare cap. And I call the Shadow Minister, Richard Fuller.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Chancellor scours the nation, turning over every stone in her desperate effort to mitigate the damage from her choices in last year's budget of broken promises, it falls to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to keep his face straight as he lectures the House on the importance of fiscal responsibility. He has shown the performative skills of one of the greats of the West End, but his mouthing of the words of economic stewardship, even as his audience of wealth creators get up out of their seats and leave the show, leaves few of us impressed. They know what the British public know, that this is a Treasury team and a government that, day after day, creates more problems, and which, day after day, demonstrates that they are clearly out of their depth.
I thank the Shadow Minister for allowing me to intervene, and as he and I hope the House knows, I'm a humble man, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm always ears open to advice, wisdom, feedback on how we can do things better. And I wonder, given his opening remarks on fiscal stability, whether he has any reflections to offer the House from the time of his party being in government, indeed from his time in the Treasury under former Prime Minister Liz Truss, about what went wrong and what we might do differently.
The Chief Secretary to the Treasury, like so many on Labour benches, loved to talk, almost fondly, about the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Well, at least she knew her time was up after 50 days. We're stuck with the Chancellor for 5 years. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, when a few months back it was noted that the entire Labour cabinet could barely scrape together a year's worth of business experience between them, it was thought to be just a curiosity. Little did we know that it was an early warning sign of their lack of suitability for the tasks of managing the British economy. Business confidence down, job losses up, consumer confidence in the gutter, and government debt spiralling further upward. And they're just getting started. There are, of course, potential benefits from the investments that are being announced today. We share a desire for a more competitive and less regulated economy based on a passion for free enterprise. But while Labour celebrates the exodus of millionaires from our country, we recognise that this represents a loss of skills, lower job creation, and the evaporation of potential future taxation to support public services. And while Labour sees the attack on family farms and family businesses as vital parts of their warped class war ideology, we recognise that putting family at the heart of enterprise is a critical piece of our nation's proud heritage of freedom.
On that point,
I'm very happy to go away.
grateful to the Shadow Minister for giving way. He talks fondly about the importance of family farms. Where was his comments on that when his party was negotiating trade deals with Australia and New Zealand that has sorely impacted farms around the country?
Well, my friend, the Liberal Democrat spokesman on economics, makes a fair point about the impact of trade agreements on family finances. But as she knows, that is very different from the pain that farmers are feeling right now about Labour's attack on the ability of families to pass on their farm to their children. It is different of scale, different of type, and damaging policies by the Labour Party, which we know, or at least we hope, they will change in due course. But the Chief Secretary to the Treasury is today also engaged in a series of phone conversations, I'm sure, with his departmental colleagues as they review ahead of that March update on the financial forecast from the OBR about what that will mean for their departmental expenditure. I would just say to him, as he goes through those difficult phone conversations, we stand ready to support effective steps on prudent financial responsibility. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wasn't anticipating. I'm very happy.
On the point of prudent financial responsibility, I think the House is interested in a long and detailed debate this evening, so I think it's important we dive into the details. On this issue of prudent fiscal responsibility, therefore, presumably the honourable gentleman will welcome our fiscal rule that day-to-day costs will be met by revenues as opposed to having to borrow money all of the time to pay the day-to-day costs, which is something that consistently happened under the last Conservative administration. That was a mistake in the context of fiscal responsibility, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm aware the Chief Secretary of Treasury is interested in a prolonged debate today. I'm not sure it is for the content of the debate or for other reasons. Nevertheless, I would just say gently to the Chief Secretary of Treasury that writing rules is different from following rules. And so he will be judged by this House on how he meets the rules that he has set. But the purpose today is for me to cover some of those rules as well. I will have comments on that. But first, though we were thinking, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are indeed having a separate debate on the welfare cap, the Chief Secretary did mention some points, and my right honourable friend will respond formally on it, so these are just my thoughts, really. So the welfare cap, the welfare cap, of course, was introduced in 2014 by Conservative Chancellor George Osborne, who recognised the particular difficulties in forecasting and managing certain welfare budgets. At the 2014 budget, George Osborne explained his rationale. Britain should, quote, he said, Britain should always be proud of having a welfare system that helps those most in need, but never again should we allow its cost to spiral out of control and its incentives to become so distorted that it pays not to work. In future, any government that wants to spend more on benefits will have to be honest with the public about the costs, need the approval of Parliament, and will be held to account by this permanent cap on welfare. And George Osborne's initiative has shown its value over the last decade, and it is right that the new government are following its intent in principle, and one hopes also in practice. Our tasks today are to listen to the explanations for the breaching of the welfare cap for fiscal year 24-25 and the rationale for the particular limits his government, Chief Secretary's government, will set for the welfare cap for future fiscal years through 2029-30. Now, as the Chief Secretary said in October, as part of the first budget of Parliament, the OBR provided their assessment of the status of welfare spending compared to that cap, which was set in 2024, and that was an excess of 8.6 billion, which indicated a breach. Now, with the country now spending over £156 billion on welfare every year, and with the obvious pressures on public expenditure, there should be a determination to find savings in the welfare budget. Indeed, that was the intention of the Conservative Party at the last election, with a commitment to reduce expenditure by £12 billion through better targeting of disability benefits, amending the levels of payments for those whose disabilities would not routinely be expected to lead to additional life expenses, overhauling the fit note process, and introducing tougher sanctions on those who shirk the opportunity to work and contribute to society. But the Labour government today appears to be set on a different course, with a pathway for the welfare cap which is up, not down, growing from this year's cap of £137 billion to reach £195 billion by 29-30, a 42% increase in the welfare cap. And it's important to note, Madam Deputy Speaker, at the same point in the last Parliament, when we set, the Conservative Party set, the rules on welfare cap, that increase was limited to 15%. And that difference from 15 to 14.2% is important, isn't it?
It is important, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I think we should reflect on what some of the drivers are behind the increased spend in the welfare budget, because as evidence is very clear, in relation to people who can be economically active and indeed wish to be economically active, the main reason for those people being in receipt of universal credit support and other forms of payment is because they've been unable to get access to either the treatment they need in the health and mental health services space, or because they've not been able to access training opportunities to get jobs that are available for them in the market. And without diving too much into the weeds, this is the issue between the approach to austerity in day-to-day spending on resource spending, where you cut spending to frontline public services, and the difference between annually managed expenditure.
Yeah, well, that's all very well, Chief Secretary, but he is talking about the wrong budget, of course. He's talking about increases and changes to the health budget or to another aspect of DWP budget. He is not talking about why he is allowing in this government a 42% potential increase in the welfare payments in this country. That's a different issue. It shows laxity on the part of this government, and I think serious questions need to be asked, and will be, I'm sure, in the next debate. But let me return, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the Charter for Budget Responsibility. The Charter was established again by former Chancellor George Osborne as part of the Budget Responsibility and National Audit Act of 2011. And at second reading, the Economic Secretary of the Treasury explained why this measure was necessary. She said, quote, "We inherited the largest budget deficit in our peacetime history. We inherited a budget deficit forecast to be the largest in the G20. And we inherited the largest structural deficit in the whole of Europe." Madam Deputy Speaker, she did not have to make up numbers, as this government has done, about some fanciful black hole. These were facts. And my former colleague, Justine Greening, was telling the truth to the nation. Indeed, truth is the foundation upon which any charter for budget responsibility is based. So let me be clear. When the Chancellor on the 13th of November 2023 said she was, quote, not going to fiddle the figures or make something to get different results, unquote, the fiscal rules included in this charter demonstrate that she was not telling the truth. In this charter, the Chancellor has changed the rules on the measurement of debt from public sector net debt, or PNSD, excluding Bank of England, to public sector net financial liabilities, or PSNUFL. This fiddling of these figures opened the taps for the Chancellor to borrow more, even while our debt to GDP ratio stands at historically high levels following the pandemic and the Ukraine war. As the Guardian newspaper, which I'm sure the Chief Secretary reads avidly, on the 24th of October said, if my right honourable friend, the member for Godalming and Ash, the former Conservative Chancellor, had acted similarly to the current Chancellor, then he would have had fiscal room that would have ballooned from 9 billion to 49 billion. But my right honourable friend knew better than the current Chancellor. The Chancellor has even had to create her own name for things, just so she can claim she is getting debt falling. She said in her budget speech she will call PSNUFL net financial debt for short. The reality is that the proper measure of government debt, as per the previous fiscal rules, is rising in every single year of the forecast. And the OBR have confirmed that on the previous definition, which she had said she would keep to, the fiscal rules are being broken. At the last election, Labour said they would get debt falling, and the government continues to claim that they are delivering this. They're doing nothing of the sort. Let's be very clear, debt is rising and is forecast to continue to rise, and we will be spending nearly £50 billion more on debt interest over the next 5 years as a result of their first budget alone. There are concerns too about the rolling 3-year targets for the rule that the current budget should be in surplus, and the rule that debt, or at least their rather dubious definition of debt, should be falling as a share of the economy. Like the water and fruit for Tantalus, the rules permit these reasonable targets to remain just out of reach every time. Always there, but never met. To extend my similes, the Charter rules are to the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary as St. Augustine regarded self-control. Grant me chastity and self-control, but not yet. Madam Deputy Speaker, this Charter begins on shakier ground with a weaker Treasury team, but it remains an important part of our country's fiscal framework. Under the rules of this House, this motion is not amendable, so we shall not oppose the measure today. We do need fiscal rules, but we condemn the government's approach of fiddling the figures to add more borrowing. They promised they wouldn't, but as so many times before, they have broken their promises once again.
Matt Rodda.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to speak in this afternoon's debate. Something of a privilege being the only backbench speaker as well. I would like to use my opportunity to speak today to make a series of points, obviously to welcome the Chancellor's commitment to growth and the announcements that she made today, and to move on to a number of other areas. If I may briefly just commend what she said this morning in Oxfordshire, and particularly the importance of investment in infrastructure for the long term, whether that's transport, new powers to streamline the planning process, or indeed to attract more tech investment to the UK. And my area, Reading Central constituency, and indeed the whole of Berkshire, benefits enormously from this type of investment. So I do welcome wholeheartedly her announcements today, and I would like to commend her for her work on that. If I may, very somewhat cheekily, ask the Chief Secretary, to perhaps take a few points back to my honourable friend. We do in our area look for further investment to drive economic growth, and I would like to highlight a couple of points which have local importance, in particular the importance of the Western Rail link to Heathrow, which is a scheme supported by all the Berkshire MPs and indeed colleagues from across a much wider area. At the moment, Heathrow Airport is unusual in being a hub airport in Western Europe which doesn't have a direct rail link from both directions, and both a number of local authorities, parliamentary colleagues and indeed the rail industry itself has pushed for this measure. It would require only a relatively modest amount of investment in comparison with some of the points which were discussed today at various, both in the Chancellor's speech and some of the wider points we discussed this afternoon. A short stretch of railway line from Langley, just outside Slough, into the airport where there already exists a space for a station, would significantly cut journey times for both workers at the airport, commuters and many others, and would attract business to Berkshire. It's supported by local business groups, and to give you an idea of the importance to Reading, at the moment it takes around 50 minutes by bus from Reading Station to travel to Heathrow. The rail link would allow a journey of just 15 minutes. So many of the firms that are relocating to the Reading area from across the wider country would be encouraged further and would have far greater connectivity to international markets through swift access to Heathrow. And equally it would appeal to inward investors coming to our part of England. There's an additional benefit, which the Chief Secretary may know well himself, to travellers from the west of England, from South Wales, in that it would vastly speed up their own journeys to Heathrow Airport. So if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, briefly mention that, I did want to just flag that to him. I also wondered if he might be able to refer or relay back my wholehearted support for the Oxford to Cambridge corridor. Potentially, the area that I represent sits at the southwestern edge of that corridor, given that there's excellent rail connection between and road connections between Reading and Berkshire and Oxford. It takes as little as 25 minutes from Reading town centre to Oxford city centre by rail, and that route is a potential extension of the corridor running through the area of Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire, which the Chancellor highlighted this morning, and indeed the rail corridor into Berkshire and through southern Oxfordshire passes Culham, where there's a significant area of science investment, and formerly was the site of the UK and Europe's JET project. It also runs through Didcot, which is a major centre of inward investment, as well as to Reading. So there would be enormous benefit both to residents in Oxfordshire, businesses in Oxfordshire and businesses in Berkshire, if it was possible to see that as one whole rather than the line stopping in Oxford. So I do hope he'll take that back to his colleagues. Madam Deputy Speaker, I do appreciate that many other colleagues may want to speak later today in the welfare cap debate, so I will try to limit my remarks and not stray too far. I would, however, like to just describe some of the benefits to our local economy in Berkshire of having the stability that the Chief Secretary outlined earlier. We have a fundamentally strong local economy. We're lucky to have high levels of growth relative to other parts of the UK. We face the same challenges as colleagues from across the country, and those challenges are very much the ones that he outlined earlier: the importance of stability, the importance of investment for the long term, and to make sure that businesses understand that there is stability so they can invest and spend their own money creating jobs. I'd like to perhaps draw out some examples of this, certainly in terms of themes for local businesses. I represent a constituency which contains a lot of tech and telecoms employment. There are something like 300,000 people who work in those sectors within the county of Berkshire, and in Reading itself there's a significant cluster near the station which has been fostered very much by not just the rebuilding of the station but also by the Elizabeth line coming to Reading with the western terminus, and that has led to significant movement of employers into the town centre, and is a very good example of the sort of benefits of investment which the Chancellor talked about earlier, and indeed the importance of high-speed rail, other improvements to rail, and public transport being able to connect major centres of employment and allowing employers to recruit from a much wider pool. And in fact, that's exactly the message I've had when I visited employers in that area. They've come to base themselves near to the station because they can actually access a much wider pool of workers with higher levels of skill and that drives productivity and growth in their businesses. So I do think that there are very strong local examples that at a microeconomic level make the point that the Chief Secretary was making today. I also wanted to draw the House's attention to the importance of education, which he hinted at, the importance of stability for, in terms of managing public finances. My own experience is that having a university in your constituency is a huge driver of economic activity, particularly in terms of creating a skilled workforce, but also which often wish to remain in the constituency, and that's certainly the case for many of the other places which the Chancellor described in her speech, particularly the great university cities of Oxford and Cambridge, but it also applies to London and many other centres such as Manchester around the country. But the importance of higher education is absolutely central, and linking that higher education to employment, having also the right programmes for attracting a wider range of young people into higher education. And it was a privilege for me to meet staff at Reading University recently, for them to talk to me about and brief me on some of the work that they're doing, allowing and encouraging young people who come from families who traditionally might not have thought about going to university to consider higher education at their local university. And that, I think, is an important part of this bigger picture. So I do commend him for the wider approach, the importance of investment, stability, linking to investment, and the investment in infrastructure, both in terms of transport, but also IT and tech infrastructure such as data centres and a range of other forms of infrastructure. Madam Deputy Speaker, moving on to some of the points made earlier, I do think it's important to see that we are at a turning point. We have had a long period of low growth, and the government's absolutely right to see growth as its top priority, to move on from 14 years of what has been historically low growth when you look at the average for the UK over the last 40 or 50 years, and indeed back to the Industrial Revolution. And they made rightly, the Chief Secretary has rightly made the connection between growth and investment. Indeed, so has the Chancellor today, and I do welcome and wholeheartedly support her emphasis on releasing pension savings and using that to drive economic growth. This has been a very successful policy both in Canada and Australia, which in many ways, although they are much bigger countries and have more natural resources, do have significant similarities to the UK, having the benefit of English common law and many other historical advantages of our system and our history. So I do think some important points have been made on that front, but above all, to avoid the mistakes of recent years, the instability, the disastrous mini-budget, the gambling with public finances, the lack of transparency. So I do think that the Chief Secretary is right to commend this Charter today, and I wanted to draw out 2 points in particular from the Charter just to flag to the House, which I think are very important. The first is the importance of reporting on capital investment, which I do think is an important measure within this Charter. And the second one is to flag up in-year pressures, which, from a point of view of managing the public finances, is vital. And as he said rightly, allows policymakers a much greater insight into what's happening in near real time and is important in avoiding future problems. So I do wish to commend this, and in summary, to say that the macro level changes that we've described today will do a great deal to support my local small businesses and larger investors coming into my constituency. I do wholeheartedly support it, and I welcome the measure today, and thank the Deputy Speaker for the opportunity to speak in today's debate.
Yeah. I call Liberal Democrat spokesperson Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Charter of Budget Responsibility is at the heart of the OBR's function, setting the government's fiscal rules as well as the OBR's broader remit and how it is to perform its duties. And it is important to stress just how vital the OBR is for the sound management of our public finances and for the UK's economic stability. I'm very proud that it was set up during my party's time in office, and Liberal Democrats have backed it at every turn since. In our last general election manifesto, we said that every fiscal event should be accompanied by an OBR report at all times, and we are pleased that the government is taking the same approach. We also called on the government at the time to establish the OBR to independently assess general election manifestos too. Unfortunately, Madam Deputy Speaker, commitment to the OBR as an institution cannot be taken for granted, as we found out during the last few years. We saw the last Conservative government under Liz Truss sideline the independent watchdog at the mini-budget and cast doubt on its forecasts at every turn. And equally, unfortunately, we all witnessed the consequences too. soaring interest rates, sky-high mortgage bills and a spike in the cost of servicing our national debt. We Liberal Democrats are crystal clear that we can never have a repeat of that debacle. I will give way.
Wait momentarily. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think the Honourable Lady is making an excellent speech. Does she also want to reflect on the disastrous impact on pension savings and indeed on people who were just drawing their defined contribution pensions at that point in time? I had some awful experiences from constituents relayed to me.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. He's absolutely right to point to the fact that many people were impacted by the mini-budget in several different ways. And indeed, I hear chuntering from the sedentary position from the Shadow Minister. And whilst I recognise that those on the Conservative benches may want to forget the impact of the mini-budget, there are many of our constituents across the country who continue to live with those consequences. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the run-up to the Labour government's budget, we Liberal Democrats welcomed one of the government's new fiscal rules, namely the switch to public sector net financial liabilities as the targeted measure of debt. We're pleased that the Chancellor made a change that would create more room for productive public investment, whilst also committing that debt as a share of GDP should keep falling. We Liberal Democrats have long recognised the need to boost public investment in a responsible way, and we are glad that the government has moved in that direction. But as we debate the new charter, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's also worth reflecting on how exactly fiscal rules are treated in our politics more broadly. While absolutely necessary for economic stability, too often there is a sense that fiscal targets can be arbitrary and that they are chosen based on what is convenient for each government. For example, we did see that the previous Conservative Chancellors changed fiscal rules 5 times in 7 years between 2015 to 2022. And what often seems to be lacking throughout the process is a sober, pragmatic dialogue about what the best fiscal rules are for our economy, from everything from growth and investment to jobs and net zero. A discussion perhaps ideally not affected by politics, but focused on what is right for our economy. Notwithstanding, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think whilst we can all agree, I hope we'd all agree to these changes in the borrowing rules, clearly the costs of borrowing rely on good economic management, which in turn, as the Minister said earlier, relies on stability. Borrowing costs have gone up, in part due to events abroad, but also because of the government's jobs tax and the uncertainty of its business rates reform and the impact that will have on small businesses. So clearly it's important that we recognise that any changes to productive borrowing must go hand in hand with the responsible management of day-to-day spending and tax changes. Also, a second point which I made in an earlier debate around the time of the budget was that whilst Liberal Democrats welcome productive borrowing for investment, we do recognise that the government's headroom is quite slim, and I just wonder whether the Minister might be able to offer a word or two about what measures his government's taking to make sure that we have a resilient economy that can withstand any external shocks. We live in a very uncertain world. There are rumours of trade wars and tariffs, and God forbid we had another pandemic. Clearly, it's only by having a resilient economy that we can withstand those unpredictable external shocks. So while there are several elements that we do support in the Charter that's being debated today, and we do not wish to stand in its way, I'd like to express the hope that from here on in we may be able to adopt an approach to fiscal rules that is more pragmatic, open and grounded in what is best for our British economy. Thank you.
Minister Darren Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to Right Honourable and Honourable Members for the debate this afternoon. I'll reflect on some of the questions and comments made in rounding up the debate this afternoon. To begin with, the Shadow Chief Secretary, I give him reassurance. I mean, he was concerned, I think, that the Labour Party misled the public. There couldn't be anything further from the truth. In the manifesto, the wording was very clear. We'd have 2 fiscal rules. 1 that would bring day-to-day spending in line with receipts, and 2 that debt would be falling as a share of the economy. Those are our fiscal rules. Now, he's right that we defined the definition of debt at the budget. That didn't change the fiscal rule. The fiscal rule is that debt should be falling as a size of the economy. That is the fiscal rule. It is the fiscal rule. There's no debate about this, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's as clear as the letters on a page. But as has been alluded to in the debate, the Chancellor chose a well-established metric for debt, per snuffle, public sector net financial liabilities, which recognises the fact that a competent government can invest in the country and get a return for the taxpayer. I take an intervention.
The Chief Secretary is making a bizarre comment, really. The point is the Chancellor stated in 2023 that she wouldn't fiddle the figures. She's now changed the numbers. The definition of debt, right? The definition of debt from PSND ex-BOE is different from PSNFL, PSNFL. They're different. It enables the Chancellor to borrow more. That is fiddling the figures to achieve an objective. It is not the same. And she didn't tell the truth when she said she wouldn't fiddle the figures.
It's a very strong accusation, Madam Deputy Speaker, which I refute in the strongest terms. The Chancellor was very clear that debt would be falling as the size of the economy. That is the fiscal rule, and as predicted by the OBR, we will deliver on that promise. It's right that the Chancellor chose at the budget to define debt as public sector net financial liabilities, and the big question is why? And as the Liberal Democrat spokesperson pointed to, it's because a government where you have stability and competence at its core means that you're not borrowing to pay for out-of-control day-to-day spending, which I think we all agree in the House is an unsustainable path to higher debt burdens. But instead, you are borrowing responsibly within guardrails for investments predominantly alongside the private sector to enable, for example, infrastructure delivery across the country, or investment in businesses, for example, through the National Wealth Fund. Now, the reason that the public sector net financial liability debt rule is important in that context is because it reflects the fact that where government has an equity stake or has provided debt for non-commercial terms, there is a rate of return. The taxpayer receives some of the benefit of that investment and growth in the economy, something that I'm sure we would all welcome. But there is the important difference about the type of debt. Under the last administration, debt was spiralling out of control because the last government couldn't pay the day-to-day bills. Everybody knows whether you're running your household finances or the country finances, that is not a sustainable thing to do. That has changed under this government. Debt will be for productive investment only, and day-to-day costs will be met by revenues. And yes, that means that public services have to live within their means, and often that means difficult discussions, as he alluded to in the spending review that I have to conduct with Secretaries of State. But all of us around the Cabinet table recognise the non-negotiable nature of the fiscal rules, the foundation of economic stability, but also the prize of modernisation and reform of our public services. You'll have heard the Prime Minister and other Secretaries of State talk about just this fact. There is a huge amount of opportunity to improve how we deliver public services, to achieve better outcomes for people at lower cost. Not just in kind of basic technology, but also in the way in which we deliver services to people, where we're delivering services designed around the person, how they wish to interact with the government, how they can receive support from different departments, different functions, receive the information they need in the time they need it. So I'll give you one example, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was at a visit in my honourable friend's constituency in Filton and Bradley Stoke, just north of my Bristol northwest constituency, to a diagnostic centre. A programme started under the last administration that we've committed to under this administration, where a provider is working in partnership with the NHS Trust, charging exactly the same rate for a diagnostic scan as the hospital. So the company working with us is not making profits from this in comparison to the hospital cost. It's the same NHS tariff rate. But you can have your MRI scan, your CT scan, a gastroscopy or other tests done in this diagnostic centre, attached to the ASDA, lots of free car parking. And I said to the owners, I was like, why is it that you can charge the same rates as the hospital in my constituency, but run it more effectively? And they said, well, we're open for 14 hours a day, Monday to Saturday, 12 hours on a Sunday. We sweat the assets more than we can in the hospital. We've got new bits of kit with AI that are more productive to use. That's why the Health Secretary wants to roll these out across the National Health Service. And the customer service, they said, was the key driver for productivity, because the customer can book their appointment, they can move their appointment if they need to, they can come after work, they can go in between shopping, and essentially the service has been designed around the patient. The patients turn up pretty much all of the time. There's no patients not being able to turn up. Just one example of how we're modernising public services. I shall give way.
for giving way. He's given a fantastic example of how improving capital infrastructure in the NHS can actually improve productivity. And one of the big frustrations in the NHS is that staff can't be productive because the buildings around them are falling apart. I've seen it in my own local A&E hospital in Watford General, where the staff can't be as productive as they might be because they're in a crumbling, cramped hospital. I just wonder, has the Treasury thought about doing any assessment of the productivity gains that could be produced by the new hospital programme and potentially speeding up the delivery of those hospitals?
The Health Secretary is actively working on this because there is huge opportunities, not just in the NHS, but my honourable friends working in the Work and Pensions Department. You can see it across the whole of government. Imagine having a job centre in your pocket, on your phone, where you can get access to the support you need, as opposed to services that are often out of town, not available when you're available, difficult processes to get through. This is not great for the people that work in those services that are there to serve the public but are not helped to actually get the right outcomes for people. And that's why this government is committed to reform but also to investment, because we can achieve better outcomes for people and reduce the cost of running public services in the long run. And that's why this government is committed to unlocking investment, whether it's through the PSNUFL debt definition for infrastructure and businesses, or as a consequence freeing up public sector grants for public sector investment. My honourable friend, the member for Reading Central, made a number of excellent points, and I'm pleased that he is supportive of the Chancellor's commitments today to support plans being brought forward on Heathrow, the enormous opportunity of the Oxford-Cambridge growth corridor. And he makes a great example of his technology and telecoms cluster and its development around rail infrastructure, including extra capacity on the Elizabeth line, because it's a classic example that is probably obvious that if you build rail infrastructure, transport infrastructure, people will come. It enables investment into lab spaces or offices and homes, and that's why there is such a strong commitment in the Chancellor's announcement today to get infrastructure built and enable investment from the private sector. And he also made a great point about the role of universities. Our university sector is one of our great strengths. We have a number of world-leading universities, as well as brilliant universities doing teaching in every part of our country, as well as research. And these are often the engines of economic growth in their region, and also the gateway to opportunity for many people. Aisha.
He made the point about infrastructure projects and the great benefit they have, and the Elizabeth line is a very, very good example of that. However, the Elizabeth line was way over budget and was very, very late in what it's doing. HS2 likewise, and most other big infrastructure projects fit that. So what plans does the government have on this? Because I note that we're later on going to be discussing a welfare cap which will attempt to control welfare spending for the next 5 years. Does the same cap apply to infrastructure projects?
Well, I thank the honourable member for the question, because he invites me to talk the House through our infrastructure strategy, where for the first time we're bringing together government plans on economic infrastructure, housing and social infrastructure into the same place. It means that when we go through the spending review in the Treasury, working with colleagues across Whitehall, we will be much better at taking place-based decisions than the previous government did. In the past, it was a bilateral discussion between a department and the Treasury with no real dots being connected between different types of infrastructure. That has led to, and is part of the problem, around a failure to capture the growth potential in different places. And so we will be taking a different approach and making sure that where we make infrastructure investments, and insofar as they relate to public investment, they are of course capped by the numbers set out in the budget. That's the spending envelope that we have. That's what we will have to work to in terms of prioritising those investments. But they will be based around driving growth and opportunity for people in the places in which they live. And my honourable friend, the member for Reading Central, made a great point about the Oxford-Cambridge growth corridor and the role of connecting some of our great universities and then unleashing that opportunity that exists between them. As I said to the House earlier, the transport and living connectivity arrangements between Oxford and Cambridge is basically non-existent. By connecting these two hubs of innovation and investment, opportunities, I'm sure, are endless. I give way to the Shadow Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to be careful because this has a significant constituency interest, but I want to ask a more general question about the role of infrastructure investments and the fiscal rules. East-West Rail's proposal to complete this railway line is a project, in its last business case, had a benefit to cost ratio of 0.3 and therefore was basically losing 70 pence in every pound of taxpayers' money to build it. Does the Chief Secretary of Treasury regard that as a loss? And if not, will there be a business case that shows that it has a benefit cost ratio that doesn't lose taxpayers' money?
It's a great question, Madam Deputy Speaker, and all of these infrastructure opportunities will go through both value for money assessments but also growth assessments. And our argument that we've been making today is that projects like the East-West Rail Line, the growth opportunities that come from doing that in a coordinated way with private capital, with the universities, with our house building plans, lift the opportunity that comes from those projects. That's why Patrick Vallance has been appointed as the champion for the growth corridor. We'll be taking a whole corridor view around the investments and the opportunity across different investments, whether they're directly public or private related. But of course, they will all have to go through value for money and growth assessments. The infrastructure strategy will be a 10-year strategy. It will give a long-term view around economic, housing and social infrastructure, but they will be underpinned by longer-term capital budgets. The capital budget that we will set in June of this year will be for 4 years, until 2029-2030, but the normal approach as set out in the Charter will be that the capital budgets will be for 5 years. And as the House knows, we've committed to doing the next spending review every subsequent 2 years. So what that means is that in 2027, when we conduct the next spending review, you'll have the 10-year infrastructure strategy, but you'll also have pretty much 10 years of capital budgets being allocated for those projects. That's a hugely important signal to investors. We're working with industry and investors at the moment to think about what the biannual pipeline might look like so that we can publish in real term the investable propositions, but also so businesses know that if they're investing in their supply chain or their workforce, that their work is coming for them to be able to do a crucial part of unlocking investment in skills and training in our country. And much like we've just seen in the water industry, where they've agreed a longer-term investment settlement, suppliers are already telling us they're now able to invest in staff and training and capabilities because they know that that flow of investment is going to be coming over that period of time. We're seeking to do that across the range of infrastructure in order to unlock the investment that this country needs. I shall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Just to perhaps ask him some further questions and to reiterate the points he's making, the Elizabeth line actually demonstrates some of the case that he's making, both the importance of place-based investment, the way that house building and flats and businesses have been built near to stations. There's been a combination of both public and private investment in this project, which is arguably part of its success. So I do welcome the points he's making, both about the longevity of the infrastructure investment, the role of the joint investment or coordinated investment with the private sector, and above all, the place-based nature of this and the role of Patrick Vallance in particular is an important one, I think, in that corridor. And I would just urge him again to look at the far ends of the corridor, both the Oxfordshire and Berkshire end, but also possibly into East Anglia towards Norwich and further into East Anglia. I certainly know that one of the a former minister from the former government has been highlighting the potential benefits of investment along rail in East Anglia as well.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and he reminds me that the honourable member for Islington North asked me about broader reform to ensure that infrastructure is delivered differently than it has been in the past. And I would just point the House to the action that ministers have already taken to call in projects that have for a long time been gummed up in the system, and we've allowed them to take place, but also to look forward to the planning and infrastructure bill that will be presented to the House in due course, and will show the level of ambition this government has for streamlining planning and consenting processes so that we can get things built, as I've already alluded to, I think, today in the House. The fact that we can build a house for someone in 14 to 16 weeks, but it seems to take years to get planning approved, shows the size of the prize for delivering for people across the country. I would just end, Madam Deputy Speaker, by thanking the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for her comments and for reminding the House why this debate matters and why the fiscal rules matter. Because as we saw under the last administration, this is not an obscure debate here in the House of Commons. This is not a Whitehall kind of guidance debate. This is important to people's lives, because when governments lose control of the economy nationally, it hits family finances. And we'll all know from talking to our constituents how stressful it was when the Conservative Party lost control of the economy, when inflation went through the roof, when it had a direct impact on people's mortgages, on their ability to buy a house. So many people lost their mortgage offers overnight because of the actions of the last government. For people in the private rented sector, their landlords increasing the rental price because the no-fault evictions were allowed under the last government. Many people lost their homes. I mean, this is fundamentally insecurity in people's lives, stemming from the actions of politicians here in government. And that's why the fiscal rules are so important, why the Chancellor is so ironclad about her commitment to them, not just hers, but the whole government's commitment to them, and why the fiscal rules are non-negotiable. And ministers on the opposite benches laugh. I would encourage them to maybe meet some of our constituents and to explain why their actions led to such hardship for them. I've not even started to talk about the cost of energy bills or food inflation that we're still struggling with today, directly as a consequence of the mismanagement of the economy under the last administration. And I think the sooner that the Conservative Party, should they wish to receive advice from me, apologises for the consequences of their actions, the sooner the public might start to listen to them again. But whilst they're listening to this Labour government, and indeed for those of us in the House today, I can reassure members and right honourable members that the fiscal rules are non-negotiable. They are the bedrock of economic stability. They enable us to be able to invest in our public services in a sustainable way, to secure growth in the economy, and ultimately are set out in the Prime Minister's plan for change to deliver for working people, so that they know in the years ahead that life is better under a Labour government than it is under a Conservative government.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I'll now give a few moments for the front benches to swap over.